Thank you. I think that's a model that would benefit non-Indigenous business as well as we, move towards trying to solve so many of the problems that we're seeing in our environment and our own non-Indigenous economy. So we have public sector leaders in our audience today. What would you say to them? What should public sector leaders do or not do to help advance Indigenous economies?
I think that if we look at this immediate context of the implementation of UNDRIP, if you were to ask yourself, if I was the leader responsible for implementing this, I think it's elevating the space for collaboration, for design, and coordination. I'm not seeing that at the moment, and this realization of the ability to facilitate leadership through conversation, through the space for engagement. If I was leading the implementation of UNDRIP, I think what would be important to me was to have each sector, each policy lever engaged in asking better questions around design and implementation. Where is the mining sector in this conversation? So I think it's like one of those movies right now, it's like super exciting part and like everybody has a gun on everybody, but I feel like we're in this lasting moment of that, and it's important to get out of that posturing. So to get real in terms of calling the invitation to the table, the realization, we need to call the forestry sector to the table. What is the best question that we can ask? What is the most relevant business model to structure Indigenous economic design and its evolution? To put revenue sharing on the table, to structure that and reflect it within the existing language of UNDRIP. We can't have everybody looking at each other, and I think for a public sector response is elevating the space for leadership, for conversation, and to ask better questions. Policy comes after that.
I agree, and it also, I guess, goes back to, taking on the responsibility to ensure everybody has the same understanding of that to begin with. So
yeah, and I've not seen that. I think British Columbians need to be tangibly engaged in those questions of not just impact or how we're affected, but really what does this look like and how do we support Indigenous economic building in this process.
And recognizing that we should be at the table at the outset, not halfway through or at the end, right? So can you give us, you've talked about Blueberry, can you give us some more examples of national, provincial, or local stories?
Last November, I started, because my company started the $100 billion Indigenous economic target, I have what I reflected back to me. I see billions. So I started a $1 billion tour, and I kind of did it as where am I seeing the $1 billion of economic activity? So last November, we started with 10 nations and partnerships that were all doing business at the $1 billion level. And we just did virtual tours of these nations and why these partnerships and developments were important. But in setting that trajectory that $100 billion Indigenous economy is possible, somehow I was from the position that I was looking at it, and then I started the $1 billion tour and found 10 nations that were doing it. But then this realization as more and more and more and more, and then all of a sudden there was some shift in there that we're in the $100 billion Indigenous economy. I wasn't looking at it as something that was going to happen. I was looking at it from a different position of this is happening. So some of those examples that I found in there was just off the top of my head, Squamish Nation is starting several billion-dollar real estate that development. There's one that's with the Three Nations of Vancouver, but there's one that's by themselves. So I think it's called Squanao Development. So $1 billion in development that they're leading. And I think of significance of projects like these. The nation, one, becomes the largest landholder in the city of Vancouver. They have the potential with the size and scale of this development to change the skyline of the city of Vancouver as we know it. And really the capital pathway to make that possible, it really lends to this narrative of Indigenous nations are and becoming economic powerhouses. We look to other examples. The Clearwater deal happened this past year. So that took Canada's highly visual story of, high systemic racism in the fisheries industry in New Brunswick. Literally, the racism that existed was systemic. So to have the nations already 10 steps ahead own a significant piece of the value chain in a single deal, essentially becoming the boss of the fishermen on the water. Those are power plays. And I think the realization of, even since last November, we'd identified 10. I think we're up at 16, 17 now. And there's just this constant reflection back of economic activity that even though there's $1 billion focus, the realization of the capital play, the equity play, the building structures of economic power, that's really what I focus on. And I think it needs to be brought into visibility instead of seeing nations on that cost side of the equation, of actually seeing nations as productive, powerful, generative, designed economies.
Absolutely. And I think, your book and listening to you speak, we need to hear more about the success stories. We need to hear more about the powerhouse. And I think that's also inspiring for other nations, but it's inspiring for government to think about what their role could be as well. So you've already talked about some of the biggest areas of economic prosperity for Indigenous people in Canada. Is there one area that is more particularly attractive? Real estate is obviously a big one right now. Are there any other areas?
I established this concept called the Indigenomics economic mix. So to look at those as levers or places of increased Indigenous economic activity. So moving beyond the language of the barriers and limitations of actually where are we seeing success within the Indigenous economy. So those levers include equity ownership. We're seeing unprecedented levels of nations taking their seat at the table in a very real sense in terms of ownership instead of partnership. We're seeing new capital structures emerging. Technology, trade, procurement, clean energy, entrepreneurship, all of those as tangible examples of, take entrepreneurship. There's so many Indigenous businesses happening, and I think it's really this response to poverty in a story that doesn't make sense. And it's in this realization of where these levers of success are happening, how do we build programs that support that rather than hamper or slow that down? Clean energy is a great example of that. To be able to look at the policy tensions, the expression of that, and nations' participation. I think I had seen a number that close to just under 3/4 of over 600 nations in the country have some shape or form of a clean energy project. And I think those are examples where the acceleration of that through policy, those are conversations to be had. I'll end there.
That's thank you for that. Because you started to answer my next question in terms of how might the public sector help facilitate the continuation of that advancement. You mentioned programs and policy work. I think a lot of that's happening at a federal level, maybe some provincial. and even locally. So I'm thinking if governments are working together, federally, provincial, territorial, and local governments, we need to be, again, together at that table and having these conversations. Any other thoughts?
I think that having a data clear pathway of what is it we want to know about the Indigenous economy and the data to support that. Right now, that's non-existent. What is it that we actually know about the Indigenous economy, and how do we measure that against? We saw last week there was a report put out that I think the Alberta collective series of nations, the language was contributed to the provincial economy was just under $7 billion annually. Where is BC's number? Where are those numbers in terms of Vancouver Island or different regions? Those are really important benchmark numbers to have in terms of growth and design. I think the data, having a regional perspective, I think the last one would be having a functioning Indigenous Business and Investment Council, to have that functioning across sectors, and being able to build a sectoral response is essential and largely absent at this moment.
So who would be on that council?
There is one, but I think it's not actually functioning. I think it runs through the MER program, but it was set up under the previous Christy Clark government that was largely focused on LNG implementation, and I think it never really moved forward in terms of advising, those things like non-traditional sectors like real estate, even looking at the more resource-focused ones, mining, fisheries, agriculture, all of that. I think there's so much work to do in terms of engaging sectors and industries in Indigenous economic growth and design, and it's not happening in a coordinated way. So I think that response is really about elevating that space, the conversation, and the questions of what the needs to now are.
Beautiful. So there seems to really still be a gap there. There's opportunity, but perhaps that's the role of the public sector in itself, to close that gap and bring those voices together. Thank you so much. So I finished the formal part of my questions, and we have time for questions from you folks as well. So does anybody have a burning question? Tamara will bring the mic over.